Arab-Israel conflict is going to come up in debate rounds a lot in a variety of different ways. You're going to have resolutions that are just straight up do something about the Arab-Israel conflict, U.S. relations with Israel, something to do with the Palestinian Authority, etc. It will also possibly be the impact scenario to a politics disad. It could be the impact scenario to a relations disad. It could be the impact scenario to an econ disad. You could use it in lots of different ways that you might engage this debate. Another reason why it's kind of an important issue for us to know about is that it is a major issue in the world, right? It is an important issue for lots of different reasons. It is not only a conflict between the Palestinian interests and the Israeli interests, but there are other things going on as well. So we probably got to start by understanding a little bit of geography, right? Where this place is located, what we're talking about here. We're talking about the heart of the Middle East. And yet we're talking about a space that is tiny, right, relative to the rest of the world and even the region that it is in. But it's right in the middle of a lot of important things. It's right in the middle of an important resource, oil, right? And the oil is not only being produced around here, but then a lot of it is being shipped through here, right? Not to the United States. A lot of people don't understand that the United States doesn't really import that much oil from the Middle East, from the Persian Gulf. A fair amount from Saudi Arabia, but only Saudi Arabia is in the top 5 countries that we import oil from. But our allies import a lot of oil from this region. Europe is heavily dependent. Japan is heavily dependent on oil that's coming from this area. So it's still pretty significant to us. As well, this is kind of a global crossroads of culture, right? It is the meeting place throughout thousands of years of everything from the Silk Road routes coming over from China to the Mongol hordes making their way through Alexander the Great going the other way, the Crusades going the other way, right? This is kind of an intersection of various cultures and civilizations, and so there's a lot going on here. There's also a lot going on geopolitically because of the U.S. relationship with Israel and how that impacts a lot of different things. That impacts the U.S. relationship with all of the other surrounding countries, right? If you look at the attacks of 9/11, what was one of the major reasons why Al-Qaeda offered for, if Al-Qaeda was behind the attacks of 9/11, but that's another issue. What was one of the major arguments they made for their animosity toward the United States?
U.S. support of Israel.
Our support of Israel, right? And so it's a source of tension that's not just about this little area of land, although that's the heart of it. So there's a lot going on here. And it will come up in your debate rounds quite a bit and for a variety of different reasons. In order to really have an understanding of this issue, we have to have a little bit of an understanding of the history. Because if, it's one of those issues that if you don't know a little bit and understand the history, you don't know very much and understand the current issue either. Because the history it really is bound up in the history of the land, the history of the people, the history of movements, across this area, etc. So we're going to try and do about 3,000 years worth of history in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Okay? That's kind of tough, but that's what we're going to try and shoot for. A lot of the ancient history, not so important. We need to have an idea, but we'll move through that quickly. Plus a lot of that's, people don't agree on what that ancient history is. So, let's go through a little bit of that. I'm sorry, the other thing is not only important geopolitically, economically, and all those kind of things, but look at the diversity of people in this area. All right, on the one hand, we have ethnic diversity. On the other hand, on the other picture or map here, we have religious diversity. Those two are not necessarily correlated directly to one another, although often they are. Whole lot of craziness, jumbled mix going on in this area, and a lot of animosity between individual groups, okay, historical animosity. And so it's difficult because we look at things, often in the Middle East, we tend to look at things with this view, nation-state boundaries and borders. And it's confusing and difficult enough when we use these borders and this framework. But it becomes a whole lot more difficult when we start using these regional areas and demographics and the stratification of that society based on other considerations beyond nationality, which is important because in this region in particular, in the Middle East, nationality is not that important to people. It is to some. It's certainly important to a lot of Israelis, But otherwise, it's not that important to people. If you look at somewhere like Iraq, if you look at somewhere like Afghanistan, they're not so concerned about their nationality, which is one of the problems we're having right now with nation building. How do you build a nation when nobody really agrees what their nation is? Right? It becomes problematic. So their first loyalty is to their ethnicity. Or you might even start before that. You say their first loyalty is to their tribe, to their family kinship group. Their second loyalty is to their ethnicity. Their third loyalty is to their particular religious sect. And then their fourth, loyalty is to the nation that they happen to be in. Right? It's not even a secondary or tertiary consideration. It's even after that. So when we talk about issues here, we have to understand that there's something going on, that the nation-state system and the boundaries that we use, the borders that we put on the map, don't really correlate with the reality on the ground, even though borders are incredibly important, as we'll come to talk about. All right, so we're going to jump way back. I'll try and move kind of quickly through some of this stuff. Way, way, way back in the day, like biblical kind of times, that people, don't agree about what exactly was happening. Roughly, historians would say that there were a variety of different kingdoms and city-states, and things were kind of moving around, just like everywhere else in the world. Little kingdoms, little chieftains, little, etc., and they were battling with power, and, different people will say it happened in this way, and it doesn't really have a lot of bearing on the current conflict in so much as that, well, there's this ancient history going on. Then you have the Roman Empire, and this is kind of where most of us start to agree on what was going on in this region about the Roman era, not because that's the beginning of history in this area, it's far from that, but that's about the first time that we start having consistent records, and they're still not all that consistent. You understand that this is kind of where most of us in the Western world start to be able to put our minds around this whole Middle East situation. Right? We can start to understand this. Roman Empire controlling all of these parts of the world. Well, then the Roman Empire kind of fell apart. But then the Byzantine Empire, or what was the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire stays in control for quite a while. The Romans they get, fall apart and everything, but the Byzantines stay in control. So you still have a Christian power that is in control of a lot of this area, and so it's under this long-term, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of control by these kind of imperial powers. Then all of a sudden something really, really radical happens and changes pretty dramatically in this part of the world, where the Byzantine Empire starts to collapse, as empires do. They fall apart over time. And one of the big reasons was because of the rise of Islam. All of a sudden in Islam, or out of the Arabian Peninsula, you see the rise of this new power that spread very, very, very quickly, very, very rapidly, and was all-consuming. Right? It was very much about lifestyle. It was about belief systems. It was about government. It was about, way of ordering your society. Right? A very, very comprehensive shift in the landscape. We'll talk about, that in a little bit more in just a second. And that resulted in this great schism, this great conflict between, East-West, I guess, between the Arab Islamic interests and the European Western Christian interests. All kind of centered on this little place that we call, the Holy Lands. Right? Because this is such an important place to several major religions. And so you have the Crusades taking place. You also have the expulsion of Jews taking place throughout the 1100s and throughout the 11 through 1500s in Europe. It's also important to remember that the Jewish people have been being pushed around in various places since way back in the pre-Roman days. They've been kicked out of town, they went to Babylon, then they came back and they got pushed out again. They're being moved around all over the place, right? So they're largely a people without a home, and that's what a lot of this issue is about, is a homeland, right? So they're moving around a lot. And then the Ottoman Empire comes in. Let's take a look at some of these issues a little bit more specifically, though. So you have the spread of Islam. Islam comes out, and you can see just by the timelines, maybe you can't see, I'm going to put all this on Dropbox too. This whole PowerPoint will be on Dropbox. We're actually going to have a Dropbox this year.
Thank you.
All right, so you can see how quickly this happens. This is a period of about 140 years. And particularly when we're talking about the 7th century, that's hella fast expansion of an empire across a part of the world that has dealt with a lot of expanding empires before. That's quick, rapid, and it just goes, takes up all of this area in a fairly comprehensive manner. Just give you another look at how that conquest and spread was happening. Very quick, in a very short period of time. What results, several hundred years later, is a map of the world when we look at it where we see a predominantly Muslim world through here. You got to remember there's over 1 billion Muslims on the face of the planet. Over 1 billion. It's a lot, right? And two major divisions, Shia and Sunni. Shia and Sunni. A lot of people in this country totally get it when we talk about divisions in the Christian religion, that there are different denominations and sects and everything. The same is true of Islam. And it's not just that there's Shia and Sunni, those are the major divisions, but there are lots of subdivisions and sub-layers all throughout it as well. So that's kind of what we're left with, is understanding the influence that Islam has on this part of the world. It's substantial. Any of you ever traveled in the Middle East? Anybody? A couple of us? All I can tell you is everything we look at and see on the news and in the magazines and on TV about how dominant and how prevalent Islam is in these cultures is true. It is very, 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 very prevalent. Christianity in this country, it depends on where you're from, right? It's either really prevalent or not really that prevalent. Islam, very, very prevalent. It's a very, very big part of every single day life throughout much of this part of the world. So, important cultural influences and historical influences. So the Europeans get upset. They're kind of bummed that their city's been lost, their holy land, and there's wars. You all know a little bit about the Crusades going on. But this is building up historical animosity. Right? And these are things that even hundreds of years, even 1,000 years later, we still think about in those terms. There was a lot of uproar when George Bush used the word crusade when we went to Iraq. Right? The word crusade was used, and I think it was only used once because there was so much blowback from the use of the term that everybody got on the same page and said, don't use the C word. Okay? So this history still exists. Right? It was a long time ago, but we're still kind of filling all of that out. Again, as I mentioned, the Jewish people were being pushed around all over. It wasn't just one particular place. It wasn't just that there was a Holocaust in Germany in the 20th century. It's that Jewish people were being moved all over for a variety of different reasons. There's this kind of historical animosity between the Jews and the Christians, right? A little bit, you get that? So, a lot happening, people moving around. Then a really, really big, as we start to move into the modern period, we start to see things settling down a little bit because you have the dominant entry on the scene of the Ottoman Empire. And for hundreds of years, they are just everywhere and controlling everything. Right? Very, very powerful. And the Ottoman rule kind of brings all of the Islamic world, not all of it, but most of it at that time, kind of under one roof. Right? And so all of a sudden you have this dominant control. And that's significant because the Ottoman Empire is starting about 1350, 1400. And the Ottoman Empire doesn't go away until the early 1900s. Right? World War I is the fall and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so hundreds of years, that means all of the different ways of running a society in this part of the world are based on the Ottoman model. Not 100%, some different places have a little bit of autonomy, but they're basically run on the Ottoman model. It's not necessarily a democratic model, right? It is an Islamic model. Right? And so you have that reality that is imposed on the map. So we jumped really quickly, and that took us about 10 minutes to get to the 1900s. So is that kind of, we okay on that? You don't have to understand all of the ins and outs of that long, extensive history. It's kind of impossible for anybody to know that. It's really, you'd probably have to study that history for the rest of your life to feel totally comfortable with it. I don't feel totally comfortable with it, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on, right? So World War I comes about. Now, in the years prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire had been struggling. And they had been starting to decay. Part of that was corruption. Part of that was probably inbreeding. Part of that was just the far-flung nature of an empire. It starts to fall apart. You can't keep things all together. And over time, people start saying, we don't want to be ruled anymore. We want to be independent. We want to have sovereignty. We want to have autonomy, etc. And it was also experiencing some economic problems. And so you've probably heard about how the Ottoman Empire was talked about as the sick man of Europe. Right? It was the poor country, the poor European country, because it was starting to fade. Its glory had already kind of passed, and it was kind of on a decline. So the British and the French kind of got together around World War I and said, hey, let's gang up. Let's gang up on those Ottomans. We've never really liked them anyway, so let's gang up together. They're weak, and they're vulnerable. Here's our time, here's our opportunity. Let's gang up on them, let's defeat them, and then let's divide their lands amongst us. Let's divide the spoils. And so they kind of do that. And the Ottoman Empire falls apart in World War I. Turkey becomes its own independent nation. And the French and the British basically divide up all the stuff that's left. Okay? And the British Mandate is this area that we currently today would call Palestine, Israel, Jordan. Right? That's the part that they took control of. The French took control of this place that we would call Syria, Lebanon. Right? Those were the divisions that they worked out amongst themselves. Well, it's a fairly volatile place, right? Because there are a lot of different ethnic, religious tensions in the area. People are trying to push in for elbow room. It's also kind of an arid region, and so the resources are scarce, and people are there's a lot of conflict over the resources. In the 1930s, as Europe is also on the brink of total warfare in World War II, there are things happening in this region as well. The Arabs revolt from 36 to 39. The sources vary about who says who did what and how many people were killed, but thousands of Arabs are killed, mostly by the British, and even a few hundred Jews are killed in these revolts, in these conflicts. And it's this trouble that is happening in here that makes the British decide, this place is crazy, we can't keep control of it, we don't know what to do here, it's a hassle, we're going to wash our hands of it. And they bailed, essentially. Not completely, but they essentially said, we no longer want to be in charge. It's too tough. They don't want to deal with this. And we skipped this part, but you've probably read it, that Britain had kind of already made promises to both the Jewish people and to the Palestinian Arabs to say, we'll create a nation for you, we'll carve out some space for you. And so Britain, as Britain has a tendency to do, is playing both sides. Right? So if we want to blame the conflict in the Middle East on anybody, we can probably blame it on the Brits. You can just about blame any problem in the world on the Brits if you look for the right connection. But you understand what I'm saying? Okay, so they bailed, which created a difficult situation, because at the end of World War II, well, okay, we'll talk about this just to give you an idea of where these areas were, right? The British Mandate of Iraq plus the British Mandate of Palestine and how they were divided. And you can take a look at these maps later at some point. So the UN gets involved. The UN gets created, and the UN decides to partition this land. In other words, they decide, we're going to take this area and we're going to draw some lines on the map, and that's going to say, this is where the Jewish people should be, and this is where the Palestinian Arab people should be. Right? And they're just kind of randomly assessing some of these situations. So the Arab population generally doesn't like the partition because in terms of population density and proportion, the Jewish people were given a lot more land for their numbers than the Palestinian people were given for their numbers. There were a lot more Palestinians because the Jews had all been pushed out and were living around in Europe, and over the course of the previous 3, 4, 5 decades have been slowly trickling back into that area, buying land, creating farms, trying to make a living, etc. So they didn't particularly like it, whereas the Jewish population generally said, yeah, that's good, that gives us a homeland, it puts us back in our historical, it's our birthright, back in the land of Israel. In 1948, Israel independently declares that they are a state. They take the unilateral decision, say, we are a nation. Right? And they proclaim that to the world. The surrounding nations immediately declare war on Israel. But remember when we talked about the Ottomans? The Ottomans had been in control of all of that area. When you're an imperial power, and you have control over all these other national groupings, you don't really want them to be all that strong, right? Because it's hard for you to keep control of them if they're very strong and if they're very well organized. So these Arab nations had not been allowed to be terribly strong and terribly organized under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans didn't want them to be. The Ottomans weren't Arab. The Ottomans were Turk. And they didn't want the Arabs to be all that well organized because that would threaten their control over those lands. And so, with the Ottoman Empire disappearing from the region at the end of World War I, and the British and the French both kind of saying, oh, this place is crazy, we don't want to deal with this, we're going to kind of bail on the area too. All of a sudden you have Israel that steps up and says, we're an independent state. These other nations around them said, well, we don't like that, we're going to declare war, but they were terribly disorganized. They were not well funded, they didn't have a lot of resources, they didn't really know what they were doing, they also had disagreements with one another. Whereas Israel at least didn't have to agree with anybody, they just had to agree with themselves. Right? And they had the ability to fight back. So Israel establishes itself, the surrounding countries declare war, they go to war, and they're poorly organized, and so Israel is able to, in about a year's time, win this war, and not only win this war, but vastly expand their territorial control. Is that the question?
Yeah.
They were able to vastly expand their territorial area. All right, let's take a look at the map. I like maps. So if you go back and you're looking at, end of World War II. End of World War II, there are little pockets, and then along the coast, Tel Aviv and so forth, where Jewish people have been either moving back and buying land and just kind of migrating back from Europe, back from Russia, back from the United States, wherever they were. These little pockets, but the vast majority of the area is Arab, although very, very, very little population in this whole area. So the UN Partition Plan splits it up like this. It's already kind of a weird split, right? But that's because a lot of the Palestinians lived in the West Bank, and a lot of the Palestinians lived along this coastal strip. The Israelis, the Jews, were living largely in this coastal strip up here, and a chunk up around Galilee, right? And then they just took this whole chunk and added it in, probably just to make it seem fair or to buy the support of the Jewish interests or whatever it happened to be, right? The Jewish lobby. There was a lobby at that time too, right? And both sides had it. So this is the UN partition. It's obvious why the Palestinians didn't like it, isn't it? Right? Green versus white. It's pretty obvious why they didn't like it. It's also pretty obvious why the Israelis would say, that's not such a bad deal. Right? So, animosity. They declare independence, and there's a war that breaks out. In the war, Israel expands their space to about this. Right? Pretty close. So, not only were they given a lot more land in the partition, but in that first war, 48, War of Independence, they expand their territory even further. So that's the basis of this conflict. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about, the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict is a holy war. I would suggest to you that most of the literature on the topic says this is not a holy war. There are certainly religious elements to it, and you could not even possibly talk about this issue without assuming that there are religious elements associated. But it is not a holy war per se. It's more, it's your typical war over resources. It's a war over land. Who has access to the land? Who has access to resources? Whoever controls the land base has power, because power comes from land, because resources come from land. Right? So that makes sense? So that's what we're looking at up to about 1967. In 1967, there's an important war, and Israel takes over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But even today, despite the Gaza Strip being Palestinian and the West Bank being Palestinian Authority, there's still an awful lot of influence by the Israeli Defense Forces. If you look at this map, everything that's green are areas that the Palestinian Authority has control over, either the Palestinian Authority or Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Okay? But even in the West Bank, all this white area is under the control of the Israeli Defense Forces. So even in this region, either because there are settlements, Jewish settlements spread out throughout here, or because they're just using it for military protection. Mountains, high country, coastal country. Why do you control the mountains in a military situation? Because it's a lot easier to shoot down at people than it is to shoot up at people. Right? So if you want to protect your country, if you look at a map, a physical map of the world, and then lay the boundaries of the countries on it, a lot of them conform to geographical barriers, big rivers, big mountains, big whatever. Right? Same thing is happening here. It's high country. We call it the Golan Heights for a reason. It's high country. So they're trying to control the high country for security, right? And that's why they control this strip along here. So it's very much a land conflict. The Arab-Israeli wars. In 1956, Israel's really worried. Israel's really worried about the Arab countries attacking them again, so they invade the Sinai Peninsula and occupy it. In 1964, the PLO is formed, Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO is kind of an umbrella group for various Palestinian factions that are fighting against the Israeli occupation. Right? Yasser Arafat, you all have heard of him, right? He's kind of the voice and the face of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right, PLO. And they're founded in 1964, and they carry out attacks against Israel. In 1967, there's a pretty big conflict that takes place. For several months, Israel had been concerned about Egypt building up their forces in the Sinai for an attack against Israel. They were concerned that Egypt was getting ready for a preemptive strike. And so what did they do? They decided to preemptively strike instead. And so they kind of took Egypt by surprise, and Egypt has something like 450 planes in their air force. And something like 420 of them were destroyed on the first day as they sat on the tarmac. They didn't even get to get into the air because Israel was really, really ready, really, really prepared, really, really efficient. They came across and they just blew the crap out of the Egyptian Air Force in one day. Right, so major conflict that takes place there, and it's also the conflict that establishes, there have been rumblings back and forth. This is the war that basically tells the Middle East that Israel is the dominant power. They can take all of them on simultaneously and still win without, too much, hardly breaking a sweat.
Was the United States helping Israel militarily during this time?
Significant to note, where is it that,
73.
where do I put this? At this point, this is largely Israel doing it on its own. Certainly with some help. Probably more French help than American help to this point. In 1973, Egypt decides to engage in a surprise attack on Israel on their sacred holy day, right? It would be like Christmas in America, right? On their sacred holy day, they decide to have a surprise attack, and they retake the Suez Canal. That's a pretty big deal. That's an important, body of water, important transport point. And Syria also retakes the Golan Heights. So again, a pretty big deal. The Arab countries surprise attack and push in, but that's when the United States largely gets involved. Because it looked a little bit like, uh-oh, Israel's maybe in trouble this time. And you saw massive resupplying, and they were able to pretty quickly reestablish that authority and take those areas back.
What political influence or whatever influence motivated U.S. to basically black and white pick a side at that point? Why did they say Israel, you are absolutely our go-to nation?
In a lot of ways, it's probably a cultural thing.
Okay.
There's certainly a closer relationship between the more Western-leaning Judeo-Christian way of life and belief systems, and not just belief systems, but modern society, as opposed to the Muslim Arab. We've always mistrusted Arab nations. We've never trusted them. We think they're dangerous. We think they're scary. We're just so different than they are. So it's probably a choice based upon cultural affinity as much as anything. Not to mention that you got to remember that the Jewish people, prior to some of this time, they weren't living in the Middle East.
Yeah.
They were living in Europe. They were living in New York City. There were probably at one point more Jews living in New York City than maybe anywhere else in the world, right? Because they'd all been pushed out of the places they'd been. And so there's a very strong lobby, right? Plus the Brits had made promises to, there had been a much longer term relationship between the Jewish people and Western Europe and the United States, and not a good relationship at all between the European empires and the United States and Arab nations.
So it wasn't there was no economics or anything like that involved in it?
There were certainly economic issues in terms of, like the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
It was certainly a concern. They wanted to see the Suez Canal be stable, and that meant either not in Arab hands or in Arab hands that we have control of. So absolutely, you can't say there was any one, two, or three particular things that would cause that alliance, a kind of a comprehensive coming together of a variety of different things, some of them meeting up nicely and some of them not so. Some of them a little bit disjointed, which is why it wasn't really until the 70s that the United States was a big supporter. Right? In voice and in principle earlier, but now all of a sudden we start making it a substantive relationship. We start pouring in billions and billions of dollars into this relationship. It's also just a few years later, right, not too long after that, in 1979, what happens in Iran? Iranian Revolution, right? The Islamic Revolution takes place, and we see what was our primary puppet state. A lot of people don't understand that between the 1950s and the mid-1970s, the United States poured more military assistance, more military aid into the nation of Iran than any other nation on the face of the planet. They were our number one recipient. The primary reason for that was because we were trying to stop the Soviet Union from reaching the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean, right? It was containment. The best way to do that was pour a whole bunch of money in this autocratic leader, the Shah, and after 20 years of that, the Iranian people got a little tired of that. They rose up in rebellion and said, get out. Right? So, a lot of stuff happening in this region. And so, it was about the same time that we lose our buddy in Iran, we had to find another partner in the region. The one that made most sense is Israel. Because we have similar views, there's a history there, there was kind of a sense of moral responsibility because of what had happened with the Holocaust. Right? A lot of different reasons kind of coalescing all together.
At this time, what were the other major powers, major Arab nations in the Middle East?
What are the other?
Yeah, like, besides Iran, like, who is the major power broker in the area?
Well, Iran is kind of going back and forth in this area, but probably the most powerful at that time would have been Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein had the biggest army, and certainly the one that was most willing to use it, right? I mean, he had loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of Soviet tanks, and he wanted to use them, right? It was within a year of him becoming president that he invaded Iran, right? And that was shortly after we lost our partner in Iran, and we kind of gave the little wink, wink, nod, nod to Saddam Hussein. We never liked Saddam Hussein, but it served our purposes to have him and his forces causing this new Islamic revolution, all kinds of fits. Right? It's like, yeah, we don't like them either. They held our people hostage, and they, nationalized the oil industry, and they kicked us out. So yeah, go ahead. Right? And so Iran was a very powerful player. Turkey is slowly building up its presence. Egypt's always been a strong power in the region just because they have the population that none of the Arab states do. Far bigger population than any of the others. Plus they have this thing called the Suez Canal, which gives them a lot of influence over commerce and trade. All right, so this is about the time we see substantial resupply from the United States. Right, it becomes pretty significant. In 1975, 1990, there's the Lebanese Civil War. A lot happening down in Lebanon that Israel gets embroiled in, partly because the PLO is operating out of southern Lebanon. Right, the PLO is staging their attacks out of southern Lebanon, just like the Taliban right now is staging their attacks out of, not Afghanistan so much, but out of Pakistan. They don't care about the international border. And at the same time, the PLO, they didn't care about the border between Lebanon and Israel. And so Israel invades Lebanon a couple of times in order to root the PLO out. Something like 150,000 people are killed in the Lebanese Civil War. It involves all kinds of assassinations of top leaders, massacres, lots of massacres going into refugee camps and just wholesale killing people, hundreds, even sometimes thousands of people, men, women, children. Right? Tit for tat kind of massacres. Retaliatory massacres going both ways. You have the bombing of the U.S. Embassy, the bombing of the U.S. barracks, Marine barracks, largest attack against American forces since World War II. And when that happens, the United States says, we're the hell out of there. Right? We're out, we're done. Just kind of like Somalia, we took big losses and said, we're out, we're done. Right? And so that's pretty significant. In the 1980s, the late 1980s, the Palestinian people who have been pushed out of their traditional homelands, the Israelis would say they left voluntarily. The Palestinians would say we left voluntarily just ahead of the barrel of your gun. Right? It's a difference of opinion. The Palestinians start to feel that their Arab neighbors are really not that interested in them. And frankly, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq and Egypt, they all bring out the Palestinian issue whenever they need to rally domestic support for their own policies and there's an election coming up or some controversial policy. But in reality, you could look at it and say, what have you really done for the Palestinian people? Not a lot. Not a lot. A lot of Palestinians in Jordan. I spent some time in January in Jordan, and I knew this before, but it really came home to me that the Jordanian people do not like Palestinians. That's not all of them. That's a broad, sweeping generalization. But there's a lot of tension between Palestinians and Jordanians. To a lot of outsiders, we would say, what's the difference? They know very full well what the difference is, right? And so a lot of tension here. And because they feel like they've been abandoned and they're not having their needs met, they rise up themselves. And this thing called, have you heard of the Intifadas? Right, the first Intifada. Intifada is an Arab word that essentially means the shaking off of. Right, to shake off the Israeli yoke, to get rid of it. Right? And so it's a rebellion. It's kind of like the early, the old school Arab Spring. Right? It's a rebellion. And so it's involved in some raids, some protests. It's a lot of people throwing stones at Israeli armored vehicles and stuff like that. But there's an increase in tension, and people start getting hurt and killed, etc. The attacks become a little bit more significant. Stuff on a highlighter. About the same time, there's an effort to try and create peace. In 1978, you have the Camp David Accords. It's a pretty big deal because it results in the first peace treaty. You have an actual peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Egypt, a major player in the Arab world, has always been, since the days of the pyramids. So a big deal. The Madrid Conference of 1991 didn't accomplish a lot, but at least got them to sit down at the table together. And so we're starting to see an effort where both sides are beginning to realize, we're going to have to sit down at the table and talk a few things out. We're going to have to negotiate a little bit rather than just digging our heels in and having a slugfest. The Oslo Accords in 1993 are a pretty significant deal. Up in Oslo, Norway, it was really the first time that the PLO and Israel shook hands. First time that they sat at the same table and said, all right, we're willing to recognize each other. We're willing to say that you are a viable political party with whom we might engage in diplomatic talks. First time. Big deal. Now, they set a framework for future issues. But as you can imagine, the issues that they have to deal with in this situation are extremely tough. And they're still on the table. So not a lot happened. Also, the Oslo Accords break down. Both sides blame each other. Both sides are probably right. Both sides are probably right that the other violated certain terms of the Oslo Accords. 2000 Camp David Summit is an effort to restart the peace talks. They fail. They break down. Second Intifada begins between 2000 and 2005. This one is significantly more violent. Significantly larger loss of life. About 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis are killed. So it's a significant escalation. In 2005, Israel decides to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. There's no conversation about it with Palestine. They just decide themselves, we're going to withdraw. Now, you can look at that in two ways. Some people would say it's a substantial move forward because it meant that Israel withdrew its forces from the Gaza Strip and gave the Gaza Strip over to Palestinians. Victory for the Palestinians. There were about four Israeli settlements in Gaza, and they disbanded them. The settlers fought the Israeli Defense Forces for about a day. They had burning tires and barricades and stuff like that, but they rooted them out, took them out. So some people would say victory for the Palestinians. If you look at it another way, It was the ability for Israel to pull its forces out. They don't have any settlements in there, so they don't have to worry about Israeli citizens, Jewish settlers in there to protect anymore. And you can essentially build a wall around this little strip of land called Gaza and turn it into a prison. And start this thing that we call, maybe it's on the next slide, the blockade. We all know about the Gaza blockade, right? Israel, and a lot of people don't know this too, but Egypt helps with the blockade. Egypt helps enforce the blockade out on the sea and on land. Okay? And it's to prevent Hamas from getting resources that they need, because Hamas is radical as far as Israel is concerned. As far as the Western world is concerned, Hamas is really radical. Fatah, the other political party in the West Bank, they're reasonable. We can work with them. We can negotiate. They'll talk. They'll compromise. Hamas, they're more militant. They won't compromise. Right? So you have this withdrawal from Gaza. In 2006, you have a short, brief war in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. You all know who Hezbollah is? You've heard this term before? Shiite militia in southern Lebanon. This conflict kills a lot of people. And they destroy a lot of infrastructure in southern Lebanon. But one of the significant elements about this conflict in 2006 is that Hezbollah survived. Hezbollah didn't win the war. They lost, where is it? They lost 10 times the number of people and probably 50 times the amount of infrastructural damage. But they survived. And for Israel, this was supposed to be a knockout punch. They wanted to eliminate. They wanted to break Hezbollah's back, and they didn't. Hezbollah survived, and they rose up from that with an awful lot of prestige, because all across the Arab world, everybody said, the only ones that have been able to hold their own against Israel is Hezbollah. They're the only ones that have ever been able to really do it. And so all of a sudden, they're a very, very potent force and player in the political military scene in the Middle East. They're also heavily aligned with the government in Damascus, in Syria, Assad. Right? Hamas wins in 2006. They win Palestinian elections in the Gaza Strip. And in 2007, there's a civil war between the Palestinians, between Fatah, and that's Yasser Arafat's group, that's in the West Bank, and Hamas, the more militant group, the more what we would, words like radical or strange, right? But what we would consider the more radical element in the Gaza Strip. And they fought a war with each other, right? The Hamas killed a whole bunch of Fatah supporters in Gaza, and in the West Bank, Fatah rounded up all of the Hamas supporters and imprisoned them. And so you have this disunity on the Palestinian side. You also have the blockade of Gaza. I'm going to speed this up because we've only got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to go quickly through some stuff right here. We have an Israel-Gaza war in 2008. That's probably about the time that most of you are even at the age where you start paying attention to some of this, right? Or recognizing and noticing some of the stuff that is going on. Gaza war in 2008. Israel launches some pretty hard strikes against Gaza. They both blame each other for the cause. Lasts about 22 days, and a whole bunch of Palestinians are killed. 13 Israelis are killed. So it's a very one-sided conflict in terms of who was the victor and so forth. Since that time, since the war in Gaza in 2008, between then and now, it's been kind of an intermittent period, what we would call a low-intensity conflict, LIC, where there's a little bit of fighting, a little bit of rockets, a little few military raids, stuff like that, but no full-scale battles being fought. During that time, a few things take place. The Goldstone Report is a UN report written by a gentleman from South Africa. His last name was Goldstone. Megan, when we were talking earlier before that round, that's the word I was trying to come up with. I was saying brownstone, but no, it can't be brownstone. Goldstone Report. And it is heavily critical of Israel. They say that they committed crimes against humanity, against the Palestinian people. And so now political opinion in the world is starting to turn against Israel. The world is starting to say, those Israelis, they broke the law. They're violating human rights, and that's impacting political opinion around the world. In 2010, do you all know about the Flotilla Raid? Right, there were humanitarians. Essentially, there was about, 5 or 6 boats that was trying to break through the blockade and go to Gaza Strip and deliver medical supplies and food and stuff like this. Well, the Israeli Defense Forces interceded. They raided these boats, and at least one of them was not ready to be raided, and a conflict broke out, and 9 activists were killed. Israeli Defense Forces killed 9 of them, a lot of them Turkish citizens, which Turkey and Israel had previously had pretty good, relationship. Both Western-leaning, Israel's our ally, Turkey's a member of NATO, they want to be a member of the EU, right? And they'd had fairly good relationship with one another. And then all of a sudden things turned terribly sour very quick because of this attack. Right? The Israeli Defense Forces said, not our fault. They were wielding knives and iron bars. They wanted to fight. We gave them one. We were just protecting our people. We were enforcing the blockade, which is well within our international rights to do, because the people that are here, Hamas, it's part of their charter to see the violent overthrow of the nation of Israel. It's part of their charter. It's part of their constitution, in effect. Right? So, serious tension to come about because of the raid. There's also this ongoing conflict or threat to Israel because of the Iranian nuclear threat. Right? If Iran has a nuclear weapon, who is that going to, disadvantage the most? Probably Israel. Because right now, Israel is the only nation in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. They say they don't have any, or actually they don't really say anything about it at all. They have a policy of nuclear ambiguity. They neither say that they do have nuclear weapons, nor that they do not have nuclear weapons. They just don't say. But we know they have about 200, 250. We know what their capabilities are. We know essentially what their systems were. It was largely the French that helped build them. We know where they're located, all that kind of stuff, because Israeli scientist named Mordecai spilled the beans and then promptly spent the next 25 years in prison because he told the world, yep, I've been working on these, we have nuclear weapons, plus we knew anyway, probably. Right? So, the Arab Spring also happens. The Arab Spring also creates an awful lot of instability for Israel because Israel is surrounded by these countries. Israel relies on a stable Syria. Why? Because that's their northern border. They rely on a stable Egypt. Why? Because the Sinai Peninsula has been a historic source of conflict and tension and danger and insecurity for Israel. So they want a stable Egypt. They don't really care who's in charge as long as as long as Egypt is stable. Because when it's not stable, that means that the Sinai Peninsula turns into a hotbed of militant activity. They conduct raids across the border and carry out attacks. Right? They fling missiles and rockets over the border because they're allowed to operate. When Egypt is strong and stable, then they're able to clamp down on that, keep things from happening. When they're worried about tens and tens of thousands of people in Tahrir Square and what they're going to do in Cairo, and they're killing people of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're not paying attention to what's going on in Sinai. And we've seen in the past year, we've seen a huge increase in militant activity in the Sinai Peninsula. Israel's very, very unhappy about that. They're very, very unhappy about what's going in Syria, not because they like Bashar al-Assad. They do not like Bashar al-Assad. But they do like a stable Syria. Because a stable Syria doesn't result in conflict spilling over into its own country and into its own territory. There's already been exchange of fire on numerous accounts between Israel and Syria in the Golan Heights. That conflict is spreading and becoming an international conflict. It's already spread into Lebanon. It's already spread into Turkey. They shot down Turkish jet. They've already shelled positions in Turkey. They've already carried out attacks in Lebanon. And now there has been cross-border fire between Israel and Syria. Not a lot, but some. Israel doesn't like that. One other complicating factor about all of this is that in the summer and fall of 2012, Palestinians had been fed up with the Israelis on the peace talk side. They said that the Israelis won't compromise, they're just causing problems, so therefore we're no longer going to try to go this route of peace talks with Israel. We're going to take it to the UN for a vote. We're going to push for statehood at the UN. And in something like November of 2012, the UN General Assembly voted on whether or not Palestine should be given observer state status. That is not full on state membership in the United Nations, but it is observer state status, which essentially says, yeah, we recognize that you're a country. And the vote was something like 180 to 5, something similar. Hugely, overwhelmingly in favor of recognizing Palestinian statehood. Israel was really upset about this because they saw it as Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, as stepping away from the negotiation table and doing things unilaterally. And as far as they were concerned, it was only okay for them to do things unilaterally, not for the Palestinians. Okay for the Palestinians to do things unilaterally. So again, it creates tension. Now the U.S. is doubling down on peace talks. John Kerry is in the region. He is going to say, hey, let's work this out, and for some reason we think that, now we've got the formula that's going to solve these problems that no one's been able to solve for 50, 60 years. But they're putting down Israelis and Palestinians right next to each other at the table to talk about some of these significant issues, and at least there's hope. There's some hope that maybe something will happen. Major issues that are left to be settled. We couldn't, in probably 5 days, talk about all of these in the depth and degree that they deserve. But those are a lot of issues. Borders and statehood. Where will the border be drawn? The settlements. There are right now thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Israelis that live in the West Bank, and the Palestinians say, you're here illegally. International law says you're here illegally. But it's tens of thousands of people that now it's their home. Now it's their farm. Now it's their business. Now it's their family. What do you do now? Do you uproot another couple 10,000 people and force them off of their homes, out of their lands? That's a tough question. That's a tough thing to figure out what to do. The status of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is supposed to be an international city. It's not supposed to be the capital of either Jerusalem or Palestine, either Israel or Palestine, but both say it's our capital. Right? So the status of Jerusalem remains to be seen. It's a divided city. Jerusalem is a divided city. The status of the refugees and the right to return. Can they go back to their homes and farms that they lost 50 years ago? Well, now there are Jewish farmers that live in those homes and work that land. The restriction on movement, the big wall, right? Who can move where? It's a internationally recognized human right that you have the right of freedom of movement. You can go wherever you want, but not there. And it depends on what your papers say, whether or not you can walk through a particular checkpoint or not. Internal politics is kind of crazy, both internally within Israel, because you have the hawks, you have the doves, but you also have economic issues. There's a lot of economic problems in Israel, just like in the United States. So it's not just about foreign ideology, it's about internal domestic politics. We already talked a little bit about the Palestinian unity issues, Fatah and Hamas, but don't think that that's the only two political parties within Palestine. There are probably another 40, 80, 100 different political parties in Palestine, right? It's pretty complicated. The Iran nuclear issue, mentioned that briefly. That complicates all of this. Israel considers an Iran armed with a nuclear weapon to be what they call an existential threat. It could threaten their existence. So we see Netanyahu at the UN drawing lines on a bomb and telling people this is what will happen if they get past this point and so forth. The Arab Spring, as we mentioned, that regional instability causes all kinds of problems for Israel. They want to see stability in those nations, not because they care about Mubarak, not because they care about Assad, not because they care about any of those leaders. They care about stability in those regions because instability causes them a problem. Stability in those regions, not that big of a deal, but instability is a problem. Two last things. Hezbollah, talked about that a little bit already. Hezbollah rose out of that conflict with Israel and all of a sudden gained some political clout. They survived. Not only do they have street cred, but they also gained political credibility and were essentially more or less given a veto in Lebanese political affairs. They became a part of the legal political structure and had enough influence that if they didn't like something that the government of Lebanon did, they could just say no. That's a lot of power. And finally, U.S.-Israeli relations are always on the top of everyone's mind when we start talking about these issues. The United States gives aid to Israel in 10-year chunks. We determine how much aid we're going to give them for 10-year periods at a time. Right now, we are in a period from 2007 to 2017, during which time we will give a certain amount of aid. The 2017 to 2027 chunk of time, and how much aid is going to be given, is going to be decided probably within the next year. Israel is making a claim for significant advances in payments or aid, significant increases in money, and the United States is kind of going, well, we've got to balance regional tensions and our own economic crisis and geopolitical concerns. So that's what a lot of, I think, that debate is going to be about over the course of the next year, is what does the future of the U.S.-Israeli relationship look like vis-a-vis military aid? What role does the United States play as mediator in the peace talks, etc. Right? Really complicated. It's hard to cover 3,000 years of history in 50 minutes. It's really hard to cover the last 20 years of this conflict. It's really hard to cover the last 3 years of this conflict in 50 minutes. What I would suggest to you is that you're going to debate this regularly throughout this coming season. Learn about it. Dig into it. Learn as much as you can. Start with the history a little bit. You don't have to go back to biblical times, Roman times, but go 100 years back. Right? Go to World War I at least.